We give you praise, God, and we are your humble servants, seeking to learn more about you, seeking to grow closer to you and have a deeper relationship with you. God, as a baseline for studying your word, it is an awesome thing that we worship a God that seeks a relationship with us. So thank you for that. It seems so basic and fundamental, but it really is an awesome thing to consider who you are and to know that you desire a relationship with us. So as we study today and as we seek truth, as we seek clarity, we pray that you will be with us as a body and that we will have discernment and that we will have wisdom and humility as we dive into your word and we seek your truths. God, thank you for this time and this opportunity and the venue to do it on this beautiful day that you have created. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, we're going to pick up in John chapter 4, and we're going to try and get through at least verse 26 today. And we might get a little further, maybe not quite that far, but that's the goal, is to kind of get to the end of that first discussion with the woman at the well. There's a lot going on. I guess you can say that pretty much with every section in John's gospel. There's always a lot going on. So let's look at those first 6 verses. And what are some things that you guys notice or some things that stand out to you in the first 6 verses there in John chapter 4?
Well, it's interesting how Jesus responds. He hears that the Pharisees are learning more about him, and he leaves. And so, there has to be a reason for that he doesn't stick around. Something about the fact that the Pharisees are learning more about him causes him to exit the area for a while.
Yeah, that's one of those things where I wish I had more information. Why does he leave? There's lots of conjecture, but ultimately it's not all we've got, but it's mostly supposition.
It seems to do with his growing popularity, though. I mean, at least here, just the brief thing we see in this first verse here, just that Pharisees had heard that Jesus is basically becoming more popular than John was. And so it seems like the growing popularity has something to do with the fact that he was ready to move along and get away from them.
I think we see several instances where he avoids confrontation before now and even for a while longer. It's just obvious that he's not ready for things to come to a head yet. The expression he uses so often is "my time has not yet come," and so I would assume that would be at least part of the reason is he doesn't want things to come to a boil yet. He's not ready for that.
Yeah, my dad used to tell me you don't have to show up to every fight you're invited to.
Jim says he needed to go through Samaria. The fact that he needed to go through Samaria is important. And I believe the 6 hours is important given the woman who he meets. And Bob says the Pharisees were getting more concerned about the influence and increase in baptisms through the work of the disciples as a reason why Jesus decided to go. And then, Jim, I think I'll save your other mention for just a minute or two. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, about the baptism. So I've been looking into it when I have time, just trying to dig up information about the different baptisms just in the first century, and there's a lot. As far as I can tell, And a couple other writers have noted the same thing. The baptisms of John and Jesus are unique in that they are, one person called it a baptism of initiation. So this baptism with John the Baptist, when you came to him, that's what you did. He's calling you out to be baptized. And all the other baptisms, they're ritualistic cleansings where people, you'd wash yourself before you go into the temple or various things. A couple other groups, one of the more well-known is the Essenes, and they kind of had an initiatory baptism, but there was 3 years of instruction prior to that. And so this I don't know if part of it is absolutely, like Jay said, the popularity, but it's different. And so it could be all of those things put together, the differentness of the baptism itself, as well as just the growing popularity. And all of a sudden now, there's something to deal with. I think maybe they're worried politically, culturally, they don't know where things are headed, but ultimately Jesus avoids that confrontation because it seems like it's not the right time. And that does get us then to verse 4, where the English Standard Version says he had to pass through Samaria. And that is very interesting wording, like Jim mentioned. So what do you make of that? Why does he have to pass through Samaria?
Well, it's not because he had to pass through Samaria, because Jews went back and forth all the time without going through Samaria. So there's something at work here other than the fact that it was the only way to go. That's the way it kind of reads, is the only way he could get from where he was to where he was going was to go through Samaria, and that's not the case. So it has to mean something else. I'm waiting for someone else to take that up now. Since it doesn't mean that, what does it mean? I don't.
The only thing I can think of, I agree with you. People go around Samaria all the time. He doesn't have to go through it. And so it has to be, the only thing I can come up with is that this is something that he was supposed to do. He's supposed to go meet this woman at the well. It's part of the plan. And I find that interesting. If God knows his creation and the timing and everything well enough and takes such great care that he wants Jesus to meet this woman at the well, a woman of no significance, she's not important politically or socially or culturally, then he cares. I think that we can assume that same care exists for us too. God cares about us. And like he wants Jesus to have a meeting with this woman, there is a sense in which God desires for all people to meet Jesus, and he'll make it happen.
Yes, Stephen. Jim had actually said something along those lines. He said it very simply. It's not geographic; it's spiritual. And I think that falls along with what you were saying. He also pointed out that Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman are polar opposites, and I think that's not unintentional. I think it's intentional. We'll say it that way. In fact, that again, I think what he's pointing out is there's a narrative demand for him to go through Samaria. And Bob also says there's a striking contrast that Jesus leaves to leave the Pharisees and then winds up immediately confronting or having direct interaction with the Samaritan woman. So the big political and religious confab is the one he avoids, and this discussion with this woman is the one that he takes at this moment.
I think when you put both of those together, you get that interesting thing at the end of chapter 2, where it says Jesus was not trusting himself to them because he knew it was in their hearts. And then, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, he reveals who he is to this woman at the well. And so it's a very interesting contrast. You guys got anything else in those first 6 verses? Anything else that stands out? Somebody mentioned the 6th hour. So that would be like lunchtime, like noon, roughly. and you're not supposed to draw water at noon. That's not that you can't do it. It's just not normal. You would normally draw water at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, mostly because it's cool, and secondly because you need it. You need it to get through the day, and then you're going to need it to begin, supper and all that stuff. And so you would normally draw at the beginning and the end of the day, not at the middle of the day. And so the meeting of this woman seems to be orchestrated. God is causing this to happen in some way or another.
I think just a couple of things from those first 6 verses that stand out to me. The discussion of him having to pass through Samaria. I think one of the other things that jumps out to me too, about as we read these accounts of Jesus, much in the same way that people will marvel at he doesn't talk like anyone's ever talked before. Jesus just does things differently. Some of the social constructs and things of the way the Jews did things. There are some things that Jesus just approaches just in his own way and just differently. And I think this is I think it is intentional of what he's the things that you guys mentioned of what he was going to do, but Jesus also just kind of does things his own way, which is pretty cool to see. The other thing too, though, is we've been going through our Genesis study, and it is just really neat to sit here and see, this is the well that was Jacob's well he had given to his son Joseph. And it's just like, so long ago, but just thinking about some of those historical things that have happened with God's people going all the way back. And, the people still recognize those things, and, they still just exist there in that time and place. It's just pretty amazing, I guess, to step back and look at that. It's pretty cool.
And I've always thought of this as just an extraordinary act of just grace and mercy on Jesus' part, because here are the Samaritans that the Jews hate. They were transplanted into this area, years ago, but they know who God is, and they sort of worship God. But here is God coming to them and sort of drawing them in it's just mercy. Here is a people that's got it all messed up. They don't know the whole picture, but they know parts of it. And he's given it to him, and that seed that he plants, just like after he departs and his apostles and everyone spreads throughout the world, that seed, what did that seed do that he planted with that woman and that town? But then you don't hear anything else about it. And that's, just another one of those things about, this is inspired, this is God, and just a little blurb, and it may have had gigantic, ripple effects afterwards that we don't even see, but it's grace and mercy on his part.
Yeah. It may be helpful before going on to maybe elaborate on what you touched on, John, that the Samaritans and the Jews, they're neighbors, and Samaria used to be the northern tribes, and you have Judah, the southern kingdom. And then at least a portion of the northern tribes get carried away, and other people get brought in, and you kind of wind up with this hybrid culture. But there's disagreement even about what's in the Jewish Bible. The Samaritans largely just look at the first 5 books, and they reject most of the prophets. The Samaritans thought that Eli, and again, it's not clear when and where necessarily things get moved, but it seems like at the end of Joshua, you've got the tabernacle set up in Shechem, and then somehow it gets moved to Shiloh. And the Samaritans believed that moving it to Shiloh was a mistake, and they thought that it ushered in a time of disfavor from God. And so there's all these arguments about places where to worship God, about what even is revelation. Where does revelation start and stop? They don't agree about that. How do you worship God? They don't agree about that. Who can be a priest? They don't agree about that. I mean, there's almost nothing that's the same. Even the way that they viewed God is a little bit different. The Samaritans tended to have a view that would be more like maybe like a Muslim view of God, whereas the Jews, it was a little more pliable, and that allows for the view that you see elaborated in the New Testament. And so there's a lot of similarities, but more dissimilarities. Maybe does that sound like a fair way to kind of summarize that? There was enough difference that they're not friends. It's maybe a way to think of it. And so the fact that he is here with a Samaritan woman in having a discussion with her, the disciples are going into a Samaritan town. Those are all really significant things that should not be overlooked. And I guess maybe one final thought before I get some closing thoughts from you guys is that the fact that we are about to see this woman, the questions she asks and the grasp that she has of things that were promised, that were going to come, she deserves a lot more credit than I often see her get. She is a very impressive individual. And so with that as kind of an introduction to the next part, do you guys have any closing thoughts or maybe other things as we get into like verses 7 through 15?
Real quickly, just to link back one more time to the previous story and this one, Jim said it's interesting that Nicodemus sought Jesus and Jesus sought this woman. It was, and we're going to talk about this almost immediately, but the countercultural aspect of this is so strong that some of it will even remain unstated because it have been painfully obvious even to have to say it, but we'll get there in just a second. The fact that the disciples going into the Samaritan city at all also would have been fairly repugnant to them to a certain degree. So the fact that they had to leave Jesus and go do what they had to do would probably have been a little cringy to them.
Yeah, we think things like racism or ethnocentrism or nationalism, all the different things like that. We think that those things are new, but they're not. People have always had those problems. And the Jews were tribalist, right? They very much thought that certain tribes were better than others. One of my favorite quotes is actually from an early Christian by Justin Martyr, and I've got to read it or I'll say it wrong. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I can't find it. Basically, he said that we used to hate people who were different, but now because of Jesus, not only do we not hate people who are different, but we live with them. And so Jesus is coming to kind of undo racism and all of those things that you see throughout history. So any other, so what do you guys think about the 7 through 15?
Well, since I mentioned it, I'll go back and elaborate a little bit. He said, or she asked him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" It's interesting. What's interesting is the parenthetical statement right after that. I don't think that's from her. I think that's from John because he's writing to an audience that wasn't from that area. And he says, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." What's interesting is what's unsaid there. He doesn't even have to say that men wouldn't normally ask a woman for anything because that would be just known. The fact that she hits on a woman from Samaria, and John feels like he needs to explain the Samaritan part, but not the woman part, really is indicative of just how pervasive that kind of, if we want to call it, since we're using the word ism a bunch today, that level of sexism is just ingrained in culture so much that I don't care where in the world you are, that would be understandable.
Mm-hmm. I also like how you kind of, to get the full picture of what's going on, you kind of have to read down further too. Because if you're like me, when you get to that first part and Jesus has been sitting at the well and then the woman shows up and he's like, "Hey, get me a drink." That seems kind of like a mean thing. Like he's going to wait for somebody to come serve him. But she hits on the issue later. She's gonna like, you don't have anything to draw water with. Ah, that's why he's waiting, because he can't get himself a drink.
But what's interesting here is that on top of that, she assumes that he wouldn't even ask.
Yes.
Which, by the way, we'll see a parable that Jesus tells of a Samaritan where you can't help but think that exactly the same thing would have happened if the man had even been able to do that much.
I think it's interesting to see that little, Tim, you kind of mentioned this a second ago, but that little aside for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. We see the way that they sometimes find unique ways to get in the way of teaching, it seems, and then Jesus is able to kind of get them out of the way sometimes and say, be quiet, I'm trying to do something here. But also they're all teachable moments for them too. It is interesting. It's intriguing to me that this was one of those times where Jesus was like, this is not going to be one of those teachable moments for them in the moment. Like, guys, you need to go on and do something else. And I think we see kind of the conclusion of that later around in verse 27, because of what the first things they say and do are, like the thing that they think when they come back, and then the thing that they're telling him, hey, you need to do this thing. You sent us away for food. You need to eat now. Like, obviously, he knew they were not in a place to get it at all, what was going on. Clearly, when they came back, they were talking about the things we were just talking about just now, the things that aren't even mentioned by John. So it's very telling to see in this part of his ministry, he's already kind of arranging those kind of situations so that this can play out the way that it did. Uninterrupted conversation with her, such a great, deep, teachable moment that leads to days of good things that we read about later in this chapter, that could have been foiled or messed up or something. I don't know that he would have let it be. Who knows what would have happened? But I enjoyed the fact that he sent them away, I guess, I think that is a neat part of the story. So that it's just the two of them. And I mean, because the last thing I said about that, it gets to be her story that's told, right? None of the apostles are going to tell the story. She goes and tells the story. So it's like, I'm telling you, this is what happened. It's not somebody else put you up to this. It's like, there were just two of us there. No, it wasn't like I was pressured. It wasn't like there were a group of people. So I think that's a powerful thing, even though it's kind of an aside.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in this story. I mean, I'm sitting here even just kind of dumbfounded, trying to process it my own self, because you have the significance of Jacob's well, the historical significance, God providing for his people, giving life. You have Jesus here, and the symbolism of Jesus providing that everlasting life and the impact that we see here in the lessons that he's teaching. You get down to the symbolism of the water, and he talks through the water, the symbolism of Jesus here, purposely, it seems, going out of his way to meet whom others deemed as sinners and not worthy of God. And so you get all of that at play. Then you get, the message that Jesus shares here, and, the fact that it's not about the temple or the mountain that they use in Samaria, but, Jesus's core message of trying to bring it back to God. And then, and then to what, Trey is saying, then you even just get to the reaction of those closest to Jesus, and they don't even understand it. And they're sitting here confused at, Jesus is energized because this is his purpose. This is what he was drawn to do, or what he came to do. And they're just sitting there dumbfounded, like, wait, did you bring him food? Did you bring him food? Like, I don't even understand what's happening here. And so I think I mean, maybe I'm a little bit like those guys right now. It's funny. You start reading through and understanding just how meaty some of these topics are in and of themselves, and then they're all together. And yeah, you kind of sit here and you're like, wait a second, somebody brought him food, right? This is just water. This is just, something simple, but there is so much meat here that it's really pretty incredible.
Yeah, and Dan, the the amazing thing about especially chapters 3 and 4, but we're going to see it again and again and again, is that one of the things Jesus, John keeps pointing out, is that they just don't get when Jesus is using anything metaphorical. They just, it's like they take everything Jesus says literally. And it's like, he at one point, and I think this is one of the reasons he says what he says to Nicodemus, even, it's almost like, you didn't read the Old Testament. You're supposed to be a teacher. You don't realize that things that there are figures of speech and images in the Old Testament. I'm referring to those. And now here again, he says to her, if you'd only understood the gift of God, you'd have asked for the gift of living water and you would have gotten it. And she immediately says, what do you don't have anything to draw any water with. And then in a little bit, she says, well, now give me some water so I don't have to get thirsty again. And then, as Trey pointed out, his disciples are going to come back and they're going to do the exact same thing when he talks about food that she does when he talks about water. It is just these chapters, and I don't care who you are. Here's Nicodemus, the teacher of Israel. Here's a Samaritan woman, and then will be his disciples, and not a one of them will get the metaphors that he is using, and they will think for sure that somehow these are all, that he's being literal, and they're just not getting it, which they aren't getting it, but not for that reason.
And that's what always blows me away when reading the Gospel of John, is because I'm that same person, I'm that same, like, oh yeah, very literal sense, that's what it means. But then when you really start trying to drill down, man, it just opens up so much more about who Jesus is and why God sent him. So
something that was recently new to me, and I think it emphasizes or maybe underlines the point that you made, Tim, and everybody, is that phrase, the gift of God. I like it when I learn that I've understood something wrong, not because I've been wrong, but because it helps me see that there's so much there that you think but you don't. The Jews in the first century referred to the Torah, or the Tanakh, their Bible, as the gift of God. And so when he comes to her and he says, if you had known the gift of God, I'd always assumed that he either meant himself or that he meant eternal life. And he could mean both of those things. But the overwhelming, I don't want to make it sound too emphatic. It's likely that if somebody heard the gift of God, that their mind would go to the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. And so it's almost like if he's saying, if you knew what was written, and if you knew who was here talking to you, then you would ask for the things that are promised in what is written and in the one who is coming to bring those things. Now, whether she picks up on that or not, I don't know. She doesn't pick up on all of it. and I don't think I pick up on all of it. And so it's just amazing that when Jesus talks, if you're not paying very close attention, you're not going to understand everything that he says. And we're going to see that when we get to chapter 6 and throughout the rest.
That's the other thing that's kind of striking about this, because it's obvious that she does not have a clue what he's talking about to start with. And I don't know about you guys, but my tendency is when I'm trying to explain something to someone and it's obviously that they're not getting it and they're probably not going to get it, I just, okay, let's talk about something different. But he doesn't do that. Getting a little bit ahead, he just changes tactics. When it becomes clear that she can't get past physical water that she drinks, he goes another route to demonstrate to her that he knows way too much about her to just be another person. So he didn't give up. He just changes tactics and comes at it from a different direction.
Okay, so I have a question, Stephen, because you said something that really got me to thinking. He says, if you knew the gift of God, which if it is in fact the Torah, and I think you're right, and who it is that is saying to you, okay, so the implication there would seem to be that her knowing her Torah would have her know who that person is. Ironically, later she will say, I know that Messiah is coming. And there are probably way more questions about that also. But from the Torah, and this is kind of wrapped up in that question, from the Torah, what should she have known, or who should she have known that it was talking to her? And by the way, I mean, in some ways, this is also going back to Nicodemus. We asked the question, what was it that Nicodemus should have understood? Well, what is it that she should have understood if she had really known her Torah, if she had really known the things she was supposed to know? Who is it that she should be seeing in this man who was asking her for a drink?
If, assuming she's Samaritan, and assuming that when she says Messiah, that she means the Samaritan Tahib, which is like their version of the Messiah, it probably looks to Deuteronomy 18, where there's that prophet who's promised. And so I think that that's what Jesus is probably referring to, is you should recognize the prophet is here. And that might be why the discussion later about her husband's kind of like makes her, whoa, maybe this is the prophet. That seems to be probably what he's referring to. If anybody else has any other ideas, that'd be good too. My understanding is that that's part of the contention between the Jews and the Samaritans, is that the end of Deuteronomy says that there has never been another prophet like Moses. And so the Samaritans took that to mean that there are no prophets after Moses. He's kind of it until this prophet from Deuteronomy 18 shows up. I think they're wrong, but I think that's where they were.
Well, and since you mentioned it, this idea of a different kind of Messiah, just from what reading I did there, I mean, that's one of the places where it seems like our understanding is a little bit thin, and yet John doesn't make a big deal out of it, even though he's already had to explain the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. He doesn't go into this big deal about, oh, and by the way, the Samaritans think differently about the Messiah than the Jews did. He just rolls right on past that idea that it was apparently much more important that she had some understanding, and it informed what she was doing, but it really wasn't correct. Seems to be more important than the nuances, the religious nuances here of what all was going on.
And I struggle with that, because when I read through it, there's all this cool information that we have. It is a big temptation for me to get stuck on that on that stuff. Like, what were the differences between the Samaritans and the Israelites? And like you said, John just notes the differences and he moves on to what's important. And so while that stuff is cool, that's not what's important. And so it is, I agree with you. Part of the frustration that I have is that John doesn't take time to talk about those things, but that's not why he's writing. It's not a history of the world that he's writing. It's so that you may believe. And he talks about what's important. Y'all want to move on to the next section, 16 down through 26 or so? There's a lot there, but so why do you think I think Don touched on that already. He switches tacks because he's a good teacher. So why does this work? What's different?
Why did it work? Oh, go ahead, Don.
He's about to demonstrate the knowledge of something that he had no logical way of knowing. How could he have possibly known anything about this woman with whom he never had any dealings, and all of a sudden he's telling her all this stuff that about her, and she says later on, "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did." This certainly got her attention.
And just to remember that John loves to echo things. This tactic has already worked with Nathaniel. He already had the exact same thing where Nathaniel, was so excited because Jesus saw him under the fig tree and knew who he was, that it caused a first reaction of belief. And here again, he's going to do the exact same thing with this Samaritan woman.
You can see her personality in this interaction. I mean, I think just like through the course of this conversation, her personality coming out. I mean, she's incredulous at the beginning that he's even talking to her, but then she's willing to engage in this conversation. And here, when she says, "Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet," and then she starts to basically ask questions. She's got she doesn't even let him respond before she starts bringing something up because she wants to know what his thoughts are on it. I think that's really interesting. She's a person that is curious and wants to have answers.
It's also pretty remarkable. We've already talked about the fact that she was a woman and that she was a Samaritan, yet he was willing to engage her. And now we found out all these other details about her life that would have not made her a candidate for any kind of spiritual conversation whatsoever, but he's still willing to engage her. And, it's just pretty remarkable that this conversation is taking place at all, but it's particularly remarkable about who it's taking place with.
It is the willingness to seek and to want to hear that seems to be the big deal here. And actually, I think Bob Hope had said something along those lines that Jesus sees. Yeah, he said that Jesus sees the potential coming through people who will become obedient and work on his behalf. And that is fascinating here because this is one of those stories where, as Don said, it would seem from our minds anyway, the least possible way of this happening. It is interesting that she has a spiritual question, a deeply spiritual question in her hip pocket that she's been waiting to ask somebody. And it's funny because very late on in the Gospels, it will be his dear friend Mary who will be praised for wanting to sit at the feet of the master and listen. And here at the beginning of John's Gospel, or near the beginning of John's Gospel, we see a woman who wants to sit at the feet of someone who will tell her truth that she wants to know.
Stephen, I thought your take on the circumstances this woman finds herself in was interesting. I've never really seen that before. You always just assumed that she was a woman of loose morals who'd just gone through husband after husband. But you pointed out that women of this time and in this culture often had no say over anything like this, that she may have just been passed from person to person against her will with no control whatsoever that she could exert over the situation. So I thought that was, we don't know for sure what the situation is, but it's a possibility that she's not the totally morally corrupt person that we've sort of always tended to look at her as because of the situation that she's been in.
And that seems like that would jive more with how her report is believed, right? And if she was somebody that did not have good morals, in her community, I think people would you kind of would know who that person is. Probably a lot less likely to believe somebody like that. So for her to, maybe be on the other side of that situation, for her to go back into town and tell all these people things, and people are believing what she's saying, that seems like that would jive much more than, again, if she was on the other side of it.
I think that's a good comment, because she obviously, people, when she went back in and started talking about this, they paid attention to her. So I think that's an excellent comment.
She seemed to be somewhat of a reliable witness, right, in her own community where she lived.
Well, and you mentioned earlier,
Jay, that you can see her character. I think it was you who said that. You can see her in her response. And as soon as she finds out that Jesus is someone special, she wants to know about how to worship God. I mean, what an incredible person. You know, that question is more than just which place is right. It's more than just, it's how do I get close to God? That is her innermost desire, it seems. Because when you meet somebody who can tell you the answer to any question, you ask them the most important question. and that's her question. How do I get to God? And Jesus answers. And so she's an impressive person.
Jim had said that I would think their dialogue was probably more than recorded here. And if so, Jesus probably told her a lot more about her life, even than we read. Because, and she does later say, he knew everything about me when she's talking to the people around. Bob said that it's interesting that when Jesus told her to bring your husband, she said, I have no husband. So she might have been couching it a certain way, but she replied at least with something that was true. She really didn't. And he says that you're right. You don't, the man you're with right now isn't your husband. So, whatever that situation was, Jesus' knowledge of her is so intimate that he even parses out what she said to be to find the actuality of it.
So what do you guys think about the response to her? You worship what you don't know. That could be a reference to the fact that you don't have the whole revelation. You've kind of edited it. But the Jews, we worship what we do know. Salvation is from the Jews. And then his answer is, it doesn't matter. The place you're going is not the important thing. So what do you guys think about that answer that he gives her?
It reminds me back, I guess, pre-COVID, I was in the middle of teaching a series on Jeremiah, and Israel, the people of Israel in the days of Jeremiah made a similar mistake in that they thought that because they had the temple, that they were automatically safe. And in that situation, it was even to a physical degree. And so they put this false hope in having the temple, that just meant that God would never have any sort of bad or evil thing occur in that situation. And Jeremiah spends his entire life telling them, you're putting your confidence in something instead of someone, in God. And I think it's kind of a similar thing here. You're putting your confidence in a place. Really, you need to put your confidence in God. And then obviously he goes on to explain the spirit and the truth piece. But I think it's such a prevalent issue at that time that's a core piece of the issue here, if you will.
And yet it seems to be a little bit of a clue that in what Jesus says about salvation being from the Jews, that it is intriguing. And so to tie in directly to what Dan was saying, I think you're exactly right that the great failing in Jerusalem was to think that the temple was their salvation. But in Isaiah 2, Isaiah says that temple was meant to bring the nations into it. And that's the great irony, I think, of all of this, is that, in fact, when he says salvation is from the Jews, I think that was, God's intent was to start there and bring the world, which is a message to us as well, he said parenthetically. And I think that the real question here to us is that when he says salvation is from the Jews, I do wonder what she would have heard when she heard those particular words. Would she have, obviously, again, she doesn't recognize the prophets, but he's basically saying something that that comes straight out of the prophets, that the first step what was supposed to be the first step to the whole world was the Jews. And this is something that I think Paul will echo when you get to Romans 9. He's going to essentially, he's going to say the same thing about what God intended for the Jews instead of what happened with it.
What do you guys, again, this is another thing that I think I used to get wrong, which is frustrating because I had a really good sermon on John chapter 4 and verse 24 about we worship spiritually and we worship like they're two separate things. And it was a good friend of mine one time. We were sitting down and he was talking through this and you know, I kind of said, well, no, they're different things. And he said, is it really possible to worship in spirit in a false way? You know, can you do this? What Jesus is talking about? Can you falsely worship in spirit? Or can you worship in truth without that worship also being spiritual? Can you do one of these things without it intrinsically involving the other? And the answer, I think, is no. And so it's not, I think both of the points are still true. Yeah, God is spirit, so we're going to approach him in a spiritual way. And that involves truth. But I think that you're supposed to understand that as a single thing. The worship that we offer is spiritually true or truly spiritual, I've heard some people say, as opposed to the way things were done in the past. So how do y'all work through that? Or what do you think he means when he says that? What is this woman supposed to understand? I guess also what am I supposed to understand?
Well, again, our language fails us a little bit here because what little I remember from taking some Greek was that the word that's translated "and" for us has about 12 different meanings in Greek, and one of those meanings is basically to say something which is something. In other words, and we take it as two separate things, but in fact, what we would say in spirit, which is to say truth, is actually a legitimate construction. The Greek just used that Greek word that we translate "and." So there's no reason to think that grammatically that can't be exactly what's being said.
It's interesting that if we consider how unearthly our worship is, we can't get rid of all physical things, and I don't think that we need to, because physical things aren't inherently bad. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. But I mean, there's no sacrifices. We don't offer animals. We don't have incense. And we don't do so many of the things that are showing up at the temple service. But then it's almost like John, maybe Revelation is written to explain this verse. you get to Revelation, right? And you see all of these physical things that are showing up in the heavenly places, and you kind of get the parallels of what believers are doing now. Our worship is different. We worship a God who is spirit. And so these physical things have been fulfilled in spiritual things.
Yeah, Tim Beaver said that I would suggest that the notion of spirit carries the idea of relationship with God in this context, and that would go right along with what you're saying. Also, Daryl had said that it was probably only Jesus who would have given this woman a second thought. All others who were spiritual probably would have discounted her as well. And yet Jesus is open to all of mankind, which is his message that's about to come up to her, is the idea that God is seeking worshipers who would worship him in spirit and truth. And that implies in it that it's not people from a certain place, but it also implies that it's people who are not of a certain category, whether it's physical or social strata or clan or tribe or nation, that all of those things would be true. And so this is a major example, Daryl said, of Christ's character and his love for all at any point in their life. And many times it's people who are struggling mightily who are ready for a non-biased engagement.
Yeah, I would echo that, Daryl, right? I think as we all read this, this should be a big reminder and a good example for us of people that we might be intentionally avoiding or skirting around, like Samaria, to have those conversations and talk to folks that are in our lives, people that we think might not be spiritually ready to hear the gospel, or things along those lines, right? This should be a reminder for us. We should be like Jesus in this example.
Jim had also said that the reference to God as Father seems important here, and he'd like to hear comment on that, since I think that he's saying that it has import as far as what you've just said. I would also love to hear comment on that idea that the Father seeks worshipers, is something that I would love to hear somebody besides me say something about.
It could be related to what Tim said, Tim Beaver, about the idea that here's a relationship. And you kind of see Paul play with that, or draw that out, where, in 1 Corinthians, he talks about how we are made one spirit with the Lord. We're married to Jesus. We're united with him. And so it's almost like part of this is that there's that separation that existed in a temple is kind of removed. Now you're with him. And then you see in Romans chapter 8 how the Spirit causes us to cry out, Abba, Father. There's this kinship. Not only are you there's so many different metaphors or images. Not only do you have that marriage picture, but you also have the parent-child picture, where he is our father, Christ is our brother. We're all united together. And it is powerful. To me, it would show a different picture than maybe many people have had of God, where God is almost this authority figure, and not an intimate acquaintance. And Jesus draws that together. God is the authority figure, but he is the authority figure in the way that a father is to a child. And maybe that is part of the beauty of that.
Jim had offered another statement about this, the idea that's directed here about the idea of not in this place or that place, but rather in spirit and truth. And that would go back to the historical context here. If in fact this gospel is being written very late as far as the writings of the New Testament is concerned, and especially if it's been being written in the mid 60s or so AD, shortly before the events of the judgment of Israel and judgment upon Jerusalem specifically are concerned, that would even carry even more of a poignancy to people, even right after the destruction of Jerusalem. They would carry more of a poignancy to those statements, and also tie into things that Jesus has been saying about tear down this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, and that kind of thing. That it would imply an even stronger poignancy to that for somebody who had just witnessed or could see the events coming, to see it, to hear him say this to this woman this way.
And that's one of the nice things, is that it's not nice that judgment came. I want to be very clear about that. But one of the beautiful things about Christianity is that there isn't a place that we have to go. We're not tied to a locale, but we're tied to one another. We are the living stones that build up the temple. We are united to God. We are a temple individually because the Spirit dwells in us. And so it's almost like wherever we are, that is where the temple of God is. And that's a really beautiful thing.
And I think that's why somebody like her as a Samaritan, and the Gentiles that we're going to read about later, as Christianity progresses, it's not maybe where before you were kind of an outsider looking in, now that separation isn't necessarily there from a, being connected to God's standpoint. So I can see that you can kind of see this excitement from her in that, I think.
One of the things that we talked about already with salvation being from the Jews, her response to this whole section is interesting to me in that right away she says, I know the Messiah is coming, he who's called Christ. And when he comes, he'll tell us all things. I don't know if that means she was not, maybe before I used to think, well, she didn't like that answer, or was trying to grasp what he was talking about. But she goes straight to the Messiah. She goes directly there with the next thing that we see that she said here. So that whole idea of salvation coming from the Jews, and then him transitioning into right after saying that, like that, to me, that could be talking about maybe that's the knowledge of Jesus, right? Like salvation is coming from the Jews. Well, that was the Messiah coming from the Jews, maybe. But then right after that, he goes into the hour is coming and is now here when they will worship the Father in spirit and truth, is now here. The fact that she goes straight to the Messiah who is called Christ is really an awesome thing to me, because it is another example of Jesus being the master teacher, of leading someone straight to where they need to get to, through the way that he did this. Because then she says that and he's able to go. She clearly didn't not like what he said, because she's still ready to hear what he says. And she says, well, the Messiah will tell us all things. And because he's kind of talking about all things soon, right? Like soon, in fact, it's here. And then she's going, well, the Messiah will really tell us, that Messiah will tell us all things. And he says, it's me. I mean, that is just what an awesome conclusion to this whole little exchange, because I've looked at it differently in imagining what she was really trying to say there. But as we've studied this today, it is interesting to see her go straight there. When he gets through all of those little things that we're talking a lot about, she goes, well, the Messiah, the one that's called Christ, I know that Messiah will be coming. And like she seemed to know that's what he was talking about. So there was a lot of historical context there, but it seems to me that she picks up on what he's talking about pretty directly. I think that's very powerful. She knew enough.
In what little I was reading about, Stephen, you mentioned that word that the Samaritans used for that, their concept of the Messiah. And one of the key components of that idea was someone who would restore or redeem not just a person, but essentially their nation, their society, and it's interesting how parallel that idea is to, when Jesus is asked, "Are you the one who is going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" That idea of restoring was so important to them as nations, both Samaria and Israel, or the Samaritans and Israel. Both of them had this idea of restoration as a key component to who this person was. The idea here that Jesus says you worship in spirit and truth, or truly spiritual worship, is the interesting thing is here that the restoration that he was talking about was restoration of the heart and the soul, rather than of a political or a chosen nation as such of physical means, but rather it's a one by one restoration of the heart. I think that's one of the big components of what he's talking about. Daryl had asked, can we worship in truth with correct processes and methods and not be heart driven, but rather driven by a desire to be compliant? And you could probably parse that a lot of ways. In one sense, and I'd love to hear, Stephen, your thoughts on this. In one sense, I think the answer is we can worship in a desire to be compliant, but is that true worship in the sense of what God wants? And maybe this, again, part of our Western thinking, right? The idea that truth is simply the rules is an idea, and quite frankly, that's been ingrained in a lot of us, and a lot of us of my generation and earlier generations in the US and in the growing up in the churches of Christ in the US. It was an idea that truth was something that entailed a list of things, and then there was the heart response to it. And I wonder, from what Daryl's asking here, I wonder if we didn't just have that plain wrong, that the idea of the truth is a heartfelt reaction to those things that God wants, and that the natural outgrowth of that is backwards. The natural outgrowth of that is that you want to follow, you want to do exactly what God wants. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the things that finally helped me see that is that Jesus, after he talks about that, he says, such people. And so he's talking about a person. This is the kind of person. And, often when we start talking about, like in Romans, with justification through faith, well, faith seeks what God desires. And the same would be true here. This kind of person, it's the whole package. It's that desire to do what God wants, but because of the relationship. It's doing those things does not create the relationship. The relationship is what creates the desire for those things. And I think sometimes we do have a tendency to get it backwards. But thankfully, God is gracious. and God, Jesus will spend a lot of time trying to help the Pharisees fix that exact problem. So thankfully, God is gracious. Do you guys have any closing thoughts? I think we're at a good spot. And if nobody does, Dawn, if you have any announcements that need to be made, and then you can close us in prayer.
I really don't. I'll just mention again, among those that continue to be need to be in our prayers. I mentioned Marvin Mann again. He's